Don't touch that, son.
Back in 1987, gaming's first Rockstars burst onto the scene. Based in Wapping, East London, the Bitmap Brothers was founded by Mike Montgomery, Eric Matthews and Steve Kelly, and their intention right from the start was to get the names of the coders, artists, designers and musicians out there, the ones that really put in the hard work. Publishers were taking all the credit and didn't want to promote the people who created those games. But it all began with Mike's obsession for computers. He bought some software and learned how to code in his spare time. Soon after applied for a job just to find out how good he was at his hobby. He was hired and soon after was earning more money than on his previous job and quickly became lead programmer managing his own team. In 1988 came their first game, Xenon, an overhead vertically scrolling shooter that was created on the Atari ST, receiving huge exposure on the Saturday morning kids show Get Fresh as a play-by-phone game where kids would shout directional and shooting commands to a blindfolded player. This is that kind of publicity that money simply couldn't buy back in those days. Mike made some work for free for a person who used a Commodore Amiga to do a game show on TV. So, and while on a meeting with the producers of Get Fresh, the idea of playing a video game on TV was discussed. Needless to say that the favor was returned. On Xenon, the Bitmap Brothers were credited on the intro screen, while Eric's face appeared in at the start saying Sector 1. On the back of the box is mentioned that Xenon was a mega creation from the Bitmap Brothers, and this was just the beginning. Xenon became a hit, not only on all of the major 8 and 16-bit computers of the time, but in the arcades also. Yes, Xenon even had an arcade machine version released through Mastertronic's Arcadia division, which ran on Commodore Amiga hardware. All this exposure and mediatic coverage gave them bargaining power for its next game, Speedball, a violent approach to handball mixed with American football and ice hockey, also heavily influenced by the movie Rollerball, set in this futuristic cyberpunk ambience, a game that took just 6 weeks to code and 4 more months to fine-tune. The Bitmap Brothers would now enter an iron fist challenge with the publishers they approached, and the only one that ended up accepting their demands was ImageWorks, a publishing label of Mirrorsoft, which was in turn a division of Mirror Group newspapers owned by Robert Maxwell. So the deal consisted in giving the Bitmap Brothers full control over all aspects of the game, from the title itself to the size and position of its logo on the box, and even to the way it was sold in shops. Their position and reputation in the gaming industry was, at this point, grounded and established. Speedball was a tremendous hit, ending up receiving the Golden Joystick Game of the Year award in 1989, and the developers themselves named the best 16-bit programmers, featuring also the artistic talents of Mark Coleman and David Whittaker. It showcased the studio's trademark chrome visual style, an intentional artistic choice, especially effective on the 16-bit home computers that would make their games unique in terms of aesthetics as well as gameplay. It was first released for the Commodore Amiga and the Atari ST in November of 1988, and later ported to DOS, Commodore 64 and the Sega Master System. The NES also got its own port, but released under a different name, Clash Ball. At this point, the team moved to a converted warehouse in the Metropolitan Wharf on the north of the Thames, a large space for them to develop their dreams and invest their money on, taking advantage of the cheap deal that Mike managed to sign regarding its annual rent. The days of developing games on suburban bedrooms were definitely over. For Bitmap to stand out from the crowd even more, and slightly following the steps of Imagine Software, Robert Maxwell, owner of the Mirror Group, offered to land his helicopter as background for a photo shoot. So Mike, Eric and Steve posed like pop stars, wearing fashion items like leather jackets, shades and t-shirts, sending these pictures to magazines for them to print next to their upcoming games, rather than simply placing a screenshot or of some coder hunched over his keyboard in his small apartment bedroom. An image of luxury, of wealth and coolness was created around the trio, but they weren't getting that much personal money. And practically all that they were making was put on for development of their next big hit.
Welcome to Xenon 2 by the Bitmap Brothers.
Originally designed by the Bitmaps, it was coded by the assembly line on an IBM PC and then ported to the Atari ST, followed by the Amiga version and again published by Imageworks in September of '89. Their coolness was once more cemented now using a heart-pumping soundtrack by Tim Simenon, a DJ known as Bomb the Bass, that also arose in 1987 with his debut single Beat This. Megablast was used for the Xenon sequel as both the loading music and in more simplified form, as a background tune while playing. David Whittaker completed the process, sampling and resequencing the song for use in the game. This groundbreaking maneuver would allow to enforce the bond between the developer and Rhythm King Records, so by doing that, Bitmap's games started to be advertised on other media outside the one exclusively dedicated to the gaming-related industry. In the meanwhile, artist Dan Malone, coming from Palace Software, arrived to witness that cool vibe that circulated inside that warehouse, something that he was also totally into, and his skills as a graphical artist would perfectly complement those of Mark Coleman, establishing at this point the visual style that became a trademark of the Bitmap Brothers games. Dan always wanted to work for the Bitmap Brothers, and finally his dream became reality, showing off all of his talent on Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe. He had a lot of creative freedom, and the general idea was that Speedball 2 should be bigger and better than the original. And it really was. It received nearly perfect reviews, and it was released featuring audio and effects by Richard Joseph, working with music written by a former member of The Fall, Simon Rogers, who was working with John Fox as part of the group Nation 12. Speedball 2 was released in 1990, around the same time as Cadaver, an isometric fantasy adventure that had players navigate through levels by collecting and combining objects, solving puzzles and killing enemies. The developer was aiming for something like Dungeon Master, but by its looks, players thought that it would be similar to Night Lore. During its long development process, Cadaver was called Aneka because it was all about hunting for treasure, and around that time, the British popular Channel 4 TV show Treasure Hunt was co-hosted by Aneka Rice. The name actually stuck until quite late on, when Imageworks came up with a more intriguing title of Cadaver. It was available on the Commodore Amiga, on the Atari ST and on DOS, and sadly didn't perform as well as other games. It was also the last game that they've published under Imageworks. The relation between the two parties began to crumble still during the development of Speedball 2. 1991 was the Year of Gods, a platformer designed by Eric Matthews and Steve Tall, with a game score again by Nation 12. Comic book artist Simon Beasley drew the cover, while the developers worked on AI that would take into account the player's position and their level of skill. This time around it was released by Renegade, a new company set up by the Bitmap Brothers in conjunction with Heath and Adele Nosedar of Rhythm King Records and a former employee of Telecom Soft and Mirrorsoft, Tom Watson. It was in part a continued desire for better treatment of developers, but also a reaction to Microsoft's demise. On November 5, 1991, Robert Maxwell, owner of the Mirror Group, went missing from his private yacht, to be found dead off the coast of the Canary Islands. The whole Mirror Group operation went into administration and all Microsoft employees were made redundant. A small number of games from different developers failed to find a new publisher and disappeared completely. Fortunately to some, Renegade reached out and would now handle the distribution not only of their own titles, but as well as those of a few other developers that had partnered with Microsoft in the past, like Graft Gold and Sensible Software. Games like Sensible Soccer, Fire and Ice, Uridium 2, HurryKn 3, Elfmania, Rough and Tumble and Flight of the Amazon Queen, just to name a few, were all published by Renegade, and all highly praised by the press and gamers alike across Europe, thanks also to a deal that was in the meanwhile signed with Mindscape International. But back to the Bitmap Brothers games, the second one released by Renegade still in 1991 was Magic Pocket, designed by Sean Griffiths with music by Betty Boo. Sean was a huge fan of Xenon 2, and he eventually went on board the Bitmaps because he used to work at Palace Software along with Dan Malone, so on one of their many night outs, they bumped into each other and the rest is history. Just like Xenon, Magic Pockets was also featured on a British TV show called Motormouth, where people would call and shout, walk, zap or jump in order to win prizes. By 1993, the Chaos Engine came out, designed by Eric Matthews and Simon Knight, with graphics produced by Dan Malone featuring some of the earliest use of interactive music, compliments of Richard Joseph. The title theme was composed by the British DJ duo Joy, of Bangladeshi origin, and then stated in an interview, and I quote, "Music enhanced the graphics and gameplay, and there is nothing more powerful than sound to create mood." Wise words. It was the team's tribute to one of the greatest arcade games to see the light of day, Gauntlet, but with its own vibe, made with its own ideas and formed of its own generation. Gauntlet provided the spark, but the Bitmap Brothers gave it fuel, oxygen and a nice ring of rocks to stop the metaphorical fire from spreading out of control. The Amiga was where it would shine, even with an enhanced AGA version, soon being also ported to DOS, the Atari ST, SNES and the Mega Drive. In these two last systems, the Preacher was replaced by the Scientist and in the US was known as Soldiers of Fortune. 3 years later, the Chaos Engine 2 was released solely for the Amiga, and by then the platform was seen by publishers as a dead system. Commodore went bankrupt 2 years prior to this release. Even Amiga-related magazines such as Amiga Power and The One didn't survive to review it. The gaming public moved onto the PlayStation and the Saturn, while the PC had already established itself in the computer gaming market. The Bitmaps were a group of friends who bonded in the pubs, nightclubs and road skate together. By late 90s, companies were starting to be run by accountants instead of creative people passionate for this industry. Even so, the Bitmap Brothers stood to their ground and remained independent. So by 1996, the team was starting to dismember itself. After producing additional work for Zed, Dan Malone left the team because he was starting to lose the creative freedom he had before. These were really hard times for the Bitmaps. By 1999, Ed Bartlett, a huge fan of the Bitmaps growing up, joined the team working as a tester on Speedball 2100 before becoming a designer on Zed's Steel Soldiers and coming up with the concept and level design of Xenon 2000 Project PCF. Working at the Bitmap Brothers felt like being part of a family rather than a business. By this time, many of the original team and collaborators were still active. But in the meanwhile, two of the Bitmap's founders, Eric and Steve, left the company after working on Zed's Steel Soldiers. Eric embraced a new challenge as design and content manager for Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, and Steve didn't code another game until this point. Even so, new members were arriving and joining in to embrace the present and future of gaming and of the Bitmap Brothers family, like Anthony Bowler, who became a programmer for the team still in 2001 and recalls that their spirit remained quite old school. Anthony worked on Speedball Arena, a follow-up to Speedball 2100, trying to revive the spirit of Speedball, now as an esports title, even managing to struck a deal with Epic for the use of their Unreal Engine, showing to the world that Epic's engine wasn't merely a tool to develop FPS titles. Speedball Arena got to a playable state with players, animations, early AI, replays and even sound and music, but it was unfortunately cancelled. The last major success from the Bitmap Brothers came in 2003 with World War II Frontline Command, created in collaboration with Codemasters, but this partnership ended up facing some difficulties at a fairly late stage. As history tells us, the project was concluded, but released by Deep Silver instead. The Bitmap Brothers also ended up porting to PC 3 Namco games, Dead to Rights, Killswitch and Pac-Man World 2. Speedball 2 Tournament came along in November of 2007, exclusively for Windows, a sequel to Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe, published by Rockstar Interactive Pictures and developed by Kiloton. All steps in the development of the game were supervised by Mike Montgomery, but failed to achieve the success of previous titles in the series. It was quickly delisted from Steam without any plausible reason. Mike Montgomery was, in the meanwhile, the only founding member that would still retain the rights to the Bitmap Brothers games and has overseen the release of Speedball 2 Evolution, Zed and the Chaos Engine in recent years. Back in 2004, teamed up with John Hare from Sensible Software and John Phillips, former technical director at the Bitmap Brothers, to fund Tower Studios to develop mobile games before smartphones took over the market, porting Sensible Soccer and Cannon Fodder and also releasing British Lions Rugby. Then John Hare took sole control in 2009 and Mike went on working as a consultant and freelancer for Slightly Mad Studios on the Project Cars series. The good days ended, but their spirit lived on in a few releases in recent times, including a mobile version of Zed in 2011, Speedball 2 Evolution in 2012 for Android, the Chaos Engine in 2013 for PC, Linux and Mac, Speedball 2 HD also in 2013 for PC, and Gods Remastered in late 2018, initially for PC and Xbox One, soon followed by PS4 and Nintendo Switch in March of 2019. By November of that same year, Rebellion Developments acquired the Bitmap Brothers back catalog, so we'll most likely witness a revival of their greatest titles in the following years in the form of remasters, remakes or, who knows, brand new games based on the most beloved Bitmaps franchises. Looking back, the Bitmap Brothers' heyday came during the 16-bit era, with its unique style and high difficulty, 30 times harder if you had a pirated copy of a Bitmaps title. Their games were always setting the standards graphically, technologically and in terms of gameplay, both for the Commodore Amiga and the Atari ST, and it's unquestionable that they created many memorable in-game characters across their titles. Who could forget Barry, Colin, Justin, etc. in Speedball 2? The Preacher, Thug, Navy, Gentleman, Mercenary and Brigand in the Chaos Engine, or Zod in Zed. Most of their games were a nod to science fiction and fantasy, something that back in those days would appeal to a truly high percentage of gamers. It was a straight shot. Thank you very much for watching and I'll catch you all in my next video. Cheers!